Good morning, Revolution, and good morning to our viewers and listeners, and also to our panelists. I'm joined this morning by Bobby Wood in Chicago, uh, Joel Wenlin Liu in Michigan, though I can't remember what town, I apologize, and Bennett in Washington, D.C. Um, so usually we start by kind of going around and asking folks, checking in with folks about what's going on. So the big news this morning, which we'll be talking about, is the ceasefire agreement, which appears to be going into effect in Gaza. Uh, so Joel, you're in Michigan, where some of the biggest Arab American communities in the United States are. Ha- has there been a reaction yet that you've seen um, to this announcement?
I'm actually on the other side of the state, so I'm not tuned into currently into reactions from folks here in Michigan to a ceasefire. But uh, uh, people are have been in the struggle here in Western Michigan and have been advocating for a ceasefire and a free Palestine.
Thank you. Um, and Bobby, you're in Chicago, which Trump has also kind of declared as a war zone and announced his intention to pacify. And we've seen some really horrifying news coming out of that attempt at pacification there. So what's the outlook from Chicago? What's the resistance looking like there?
I think everyone has some sense of relief that we're going to see, hopefully, some reprieve from this genocidal violence and the promise of aid trucks coming in. And this is not gratuitous. This is a major victory from all of the forces around the world and also in the U.S. But I think there's also a note of caution because this is like the seventh time that there's been in the last 15 or 20 years of notice of a ceasefire, and keeping together the forces that force this and to make it happen is going to be a major challenge. This 20-point plan that Trump is talking about, there's none of those points have been elaborated, and 20 points, this is only one step. So I think it's a signal to everybody to keep the pressure up.
Absolutely. And Bennett, so similar question to you. You're in the District of Columbia, which has been under the kind of thumb of a federalized police force, and so what's the resistance they're looking like, and how has it greeted the news of the ceasefire?
Well, I think that the resistance movement in DC is still growing. I think a lot of that is due to the fact that our mayor is largely capitulating to the federalization of the police force in DC, still allowing them to collaborate with ICE. Um, but in terms of the ceasefire announcement, I think that people are taking a moment to experience relief, but also grief. And I think that there's also a lot of caution because Israel has violated multiple ceasefires, including throughout their current genocidal escalation. Um, and typically, they continue to murder largely with impunity before the ceasefire goes into effect, which they have been doing. Multiple people have already been murdered by the occupation since the announcement. So I think that there is a mixture of reactions.
Yeah, and that point is very well taken. Our one of our comrades in Israel, a Palestinian citizen of Israel, Ada Tuma Sliman, who's also a member of the Knesset for the Hadash coalition and a leader in the the Maki, the Communist Party of Israel, has pointed out that this is, a substantial victory, and a victory based in the resistance of the Palestinian people, um, uh, and also of a worldwide movement, but that there is this need for caution and for continued pressure, and to make sure that this, um, in the first place, is a real ceasefire, and that it progresses toward realization of um, a broader peace and the rights of the Palestinian people. So one of the if we look at the media here in the U.S., there's this agreement, it seems like, to call this a Trump peace plan, this 20-point thing. Is that how you would characterize it, Joel?
Uh, Definitely not. This is the culmination of struggles that have been ongoing since 2023, but also prior to that. And I think what others have already indicated is that there's a pattern that has emerged. And while Trump has sort of felt pressure to move in that direction, I think the international context probably played one of the larger roles in forcing that decision as well. I mean, we saw a number of countries recognize Palestine as a state, and increasingly isolating the United States and some of its sort of normal allies in the UN who typically vote with the US on things of this nature. And we saw that isolation grow. And normally, I think that doesn't really bother people like Donald Trump, but I think in this situation it has. And internally in the United States, the push for a ceasefire, the movement for a ceasefire, has also ramped up the pressure, right? And the discussions around the Israeli policies, military actions, right? The mass killings, mass death, starvation policies, etc. The destruction of hospitals, media centers, the killing and assassination of journalists have all sort of um, could not be suppressed, right? Despite sort of media blockades on that kind of information, could not be suppressed here in the United States. So public opinion has swayed, right? In Israel, and the U.S. Policy toward Israel has become increasingly unpopular in this country as well.
Absolutely. And Joel, you introduced a really sort of important idea about the breadth of this world movement and the increasing isolation of both the United States and Israel. And that kind of it's based in a Marxist way of looking at sort of how change happens. And one of the big components of that is this idea of a balance of forces. That we have to look at what forces are entering into the struggle on different sides, and how their strength compares, to understand what's really going on. And I was wondering, Bennett, if you could kind of speak to that a bit. What have we seen? What are some of the forces that have ramped up their participation in the struggle for the rights of the Palestinian people?
I think that we've seen not just an international protest movement, but also we've seen um, international brigades in flotillas who are trying to pressure the Israeli occupation and are trying to deliver aid and bring attention to kind of the ongoing nature of this issue. But we've also seen labor in places like Italy take a more militant stance. And I think also important to recognize is that domestically within Palestine, we've seen the reestablishing and unification of kind of agreements between different resistance factions that have allowed for a more unified approach to these issues, which I think we are seeing the aftermath of with this ceasefire agreement, which is ultimately the outcome of kind of ongoing and steadfast resistance, not just around the world, but also in Palestine. So I think that the balance of forces is definitely shifting all over the world with, from just domestic protest movements, but also from kind of international labor organizing and international aid organizing that is pressuring the occupation to have to, be isolated within the international sphere.
Thank you. And Bobby, Bennett mentioned the growing role of labor in some countries, in Italy, in Greece, also in India. Earlier on, we saw workers blocking shipments of arms to Israel, in Belgium. So what is the role of the U.S. working class in this struggle? What is what are we called to do?
Well, Scott, I think it's interesting that there's almost a coming together of this anti war movement, in support of the Palestinian people, and the struggle for democracy here in the U.S., because we're almost seeing the same kind of forces arrayed against both of them. So I think it's important for us to keep in mind that everybody isn't for peace in the Middle East. There's those who have a vested interest in keeping conflict going, regardless of the horrible human toll and death and suffering and destruction. The military industry is, going to the bank with all of the spending that's our tax dollars, but is being spent on developing all of these horrible weapons that are killing people, all the destruction. And nowadays, the military industry is intertwined with the tech industry, because that's the kind of military weapons we see. And that's the same thing that's happening here in the U.S. with the anti-immigrant push. It's not just against immigrants, it's also a huge profit source for the detention industry, the military industry, and all, which is all intertwined with finance capital. So I think, getting back to your question about the working class, we see the same forces arrayed against both. Just to speak a little bit about those who have a vested interest in keeping the conflict going there. There's also, we can't forget about the oil industry, which does not, for decades, has made sure that the people of that region don't really have control over the resources of it, to keep the region destabilized. I've heard that there's a big possibility of huge natural gas deposits off of Gaza. Naturally, the oil industry would like to control those. And finally, just to mention that I think the capitalist forces in Israel and the Netanyahu government are very, more than anywhere else, intertwined with the capital class of the United States. Jared Kushner would be a good example of that, in their interests in using one to build up the strength of the other.
Absolutely. And that's, that brings out an important point again about, how we see the world as Marxists, right? We talk about proletarian internationalism, working class internationalism, which means that we understand that that as workers in one of the imperialist powers, we have not only a moral obligation, a moral duty to support national liberation movement, but also a material interest in doing so. Our struggle for democracy here, our struggle for the rights of the working class here, is intertwined with workers' struggles and national liberation struggles around the globe. So, what are the next steps?
Well, Scott, I don't think we
What are the
can.
next steps here in the United States?
I didn't hear you.
Sorry, I'm picking up there. So just a quick go around. What are the next steps here in the United States? What are where do we build the movement, and what are the demands that folks are bringing forth?
Well, coming from Chicago, I have to say that we are so focused on kicking ICE out of our city, and the National Guard, many of whom are our brothers, and they're not our enemy, but we have to protect them by keeping them out of these horrible situations. We have No King's Day coming up a week from tomorrow, and I think that'll be a place where the American people can really be heard. I wanted to draw attention to the growing peace movement and recognize the special role that the Palestinian community has played in building this, and also the student movement, and I think, and the labor movement. Even there's been many initiatives by unions and a coalition that's supporting peace. Also, the Jewish community, where a role of anti-Zionist and non-Zionist Jews have challenged the narrative that being anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic, making space for people to join this movement. And this movement now, I think, can be a full part of the No Kings movement and fighting against militarization for the rights of immigrants, and really building a united front on that. So let me just give you an example. Wednesday, at a demonstration in the front of the federal building in Chicago, federal workers were joined by almost the entire Illinois congressional delegation. Sean Casten, Jan Schakowsky, Danny Davis, Chuy Garcia, Delio Ramirez, all standing together, and surprise joined by Governor Pritzker, demanding the rights of people of Illinois to be safe and not have this invasion of ICE troops. All of these issues come together, and with the rights of the Palestinian people in the Middle East.
Thanks
I
to
think
our
you're muted.
producers. I was muted there. Bennett, what are the big issues around which the U.S. working class can and its allies can rally, in defense of their own rights and of the rights of the Palestinian people?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that the ceasefire is not the end, it's the beginning. The siege is still in place, the occupation is still in place. Israel maintains its role as an apartheid state. I think it's important that we continue to mobilize and keep our foot on the gas, so to speak, to continue to pressure our governments to divest, to end military aid, to end all kind of aid to Israel. And I think it's important to recognize that a genocide has taken place, and it's our duty to ensure that there are consequences for that, and that the people who have perpetuated this are held accountable, both leaders from the United States and leaders from Israel itself. I think that it's important that we ensure that a precedent isn't set where genocide can just happen without consequence. And I think that is also an important element to this. And it's important for us to keep the pressure on so that a ceasefire actually can lead to a lasting justice for the people in Palestine, and that Israel is not able to simply go back to business as usual or violate the ceasefire and continue their genocidal escalation.
And that's enormously important. That the question of accountability and the idea that no one should be allowed to place themselves in a condition of impunity, of being not subject to international law, to the decisions of the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice, right? To honor the arrest warrant for Netanyahu, for example, and to to bring the U.S. into compliance with the International Criminal Court, and on the subject of divestment as well, right? Divestment from firms profiting from the genocide in Palestine, which includes the huge defense contractors here in the United States that are sucking up billions of dollars of our money. So demilitarizing our budget is linked to that. Um, and we we do need to recognize that real peace can't be based on military subjugation of the Palestinian liberation movement. That we can't really talk about peace uh, until Palestine is free, until the Palestinian people can chart their own future in a sovereign Palestinian state. Right? There can be the ceasefire is a step, as Bennett pointed out, toward that, and as others have pointed out. It's an important development. It gives much better conditions for organizing that resistance and building solidarity internationally for it. But this is not the end of the struggle, and it's going to take a huge amount of work to push this ceasefire agreement toward a movement for and a realization of justice for the Palestinian people. So this is a victory for the Palestinian people, for the people in Gaza, for those forces in Israel that were opposed to the war and to fascism and to genocide. A victory for the world anti-imperialist movement, and as Joel pointed out, that which has been able to isolate both Israel and the United States. That question of isolation kind of brings us to our other topic this morning, which is the controversy around the Super Bowl halftime show. We've seen the NFL has asked a Puerto Rican performer Bad Bunny, who's one of the most popular performers on the planet, to do the Super Bowl halftime show, and some folks are not happy about that. Joel, can you kind of sum up for us what's happening with this?
Well, I think what the controversy surrounding this particular incident reveals something about the hostility people in the MAGA crowd and the pro-Trump crowd have, and some sort of fundamental misunderstandings of history, right, that they bring to this discussion. Right, ever since Puerto Rico became a territory of the United States and Puerto Ricans were granted citizenship in 1917, there's been a recurring effort by some Euro-Americans who sort of are motivated by white supremacy and racism to view them as people who don't belong, people who aren't part of this country, don't belong, should, right? And there was a Trump politician recently who a little while back who told AOC, right, New York Congresswoman, who is of Puerto Rican heritage, to go back to her country, right? And that I think is the issue here, right? There's a sense that Puerto Ricans are not Americans, right? And we can have special views about the right of national self-determination for Puerto Rico, but the reality is there's this legal standing within the context of the United States, and so when people say that they're not really Americans and they, as Spanish speakers, they don't belong, right? They're really exposing their racial views, their racist views about who effectively is a citizen of the United States, who belongs, and so on and so forth. And that really exposes what the immigration policy is about, right? They're not a lot of what that immigration policy centers around is controlling non-white populations, right? And a lot of it has to do with trying to maintain a white majority of Euro-Americans, people who advocate white supremacy, et cetera, rather than the big demographic shift that's set to occur in the next few years, where whites become a minority of the U.S. population, right? So they're really concerned and angry about that, right? And I think that's really at the heart of this. Our working class, right? The people who built this country, that's a lot of rhetoric that they talk about too. The people who built this country are the real Americans, right? The people who built this country are a multinational, multiracial, multi-religious people who come from dozens and dozens and dozens of countries over the history of the existence of this country. They're the people who built this country. And so when people talk about this trying to return to this sort of idealized version of a white country, right? They don't directly say it, but this kind of hostility about a popular singer, a very popular singer, right? Is sort of reveals the real agenda, and it's a really a racist agenda, and it's something that I think most people who live in this country have moved well past, but it's still sort of at the heart of the Trump agenda.
Exactly. And before you brought up that idea that most of the people of this country have moved past that kind of white supremacist understanding of our history. Um, uh, and I think we need to come back to that. Before we do, one of the privileges of being the host is that I get to ask trivia questions that I know the answers to, and nobody else does. But just one of the things that Turning Point USA and these MAGA forces are talking about is that Bad Bunny is too divisive, and that we need someone who can bring people together. Um, so I wanted to kind of look at what the most viewed sporting events in the world are and where the Super Bowl ranks in them. Um, does anyone have any idea of what of where the Super Bowl stands? What are the biggest sporting events in the world? Bobby, do you have any guess?
Olympics.
The Olympics are big, very very big, absolutely. Um, I think about 450 million viewers for the last Summer Olympics. Bennett, what about you?
I would say the FIFA World Cup.
Enormous, yeah. So the last World Cup, across the entire series, 5 billion people watched, and just for the final match, there were 1.5 billion people watching. But there's a bigger one as well, and Joel walks home with the whole prize pot of $0 if he can get it. But
If I can get it, well, the soccer was my guess, but I'm going to go with tennis.
the Cricket World Cup in 2019, the final match of the Cricket World Cup, 1.6 billion viewers, right? The Super Bowl, so those are enormous numbers. The Super Bowl is a big event. It reaches 123.7 million people in the United States, and probably a very small international viewership as well. So it's an order of magnitude smaller than the world's biggest sporting events. So already, you know, we see this. I think in the United States, we tend to think of our culture, our sporting events, whatever, as the dominant, culture of the world, and it's really not, right? There's already a level of isolation there, and now you have these MAGA forces trying to say that having one of the world's most popular performers perform at the Super Bowl is going to be too divisive. So, they're asking for, some of the folks they've mentioned are Lee Greenwood and Kid Rock, these folks that are like half a step above the county fair circuit. So, what is this? Getting back to Joel's point about kind of a minority, uh, this being a minority position, what does that tell us about the reach of the white supremacist right in the United States, Bobby?
I'm glad you asked that. The popularity of Bad Bunny reveals the lie of the MAGA ideology, his popularity. And I just want to mention, we've been talking about all the terrible and horrible things going on, but this controversy about Bad Bunny, I think gives us a chance to have a little joy in this moment, when there's not a lot of happiness, to celebrate our working class culture, our multinational working class culture that's celebrated and supported by the vast majority of the American people, and that culture includes his spirit of not backing down, of taking it right to them. And I loved the part where he speaks in Spanish, because our culture and our working class culture is also a bilingual culture, and that's a wonderful, beautiful strength that people everywhere can celebrate. So I think this is a cause for celebration and pride in our working class culture, that every working class person in the country and the world can identify with Bad Bunny and his fighting spirit.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that kind of brings out, one of the part of the way that we think about social change and the interaction of different cultures. This idea of you know cordoning cultures off from one another and keeping them pure and whatever as is complete something that Marxism completely rejects, right? As nations interact, they bring forth the best parts of their culture and they share it, right? And even within a multinational state like the United States, different nationalities bring forth, you know, the elements of their culture, and it creates this sharing that elevates all of us. So on this question of the isolation of the MAGA right and how out of touch they are, I kind of wanted to ask a question that Frederick Douglass asked in a speech in 1851, which is, he brought out that the slave owners were a minority. The big slave owners were a small minority of people in the South, um, and even a smaller minority of people in the country. And yet they managed to punch so far above their weight in um, in politics, in culture, in you know the way and what laws get passed. Why is that? What's what? Why are they in this position to punch above their weight, their demographic weight?
Well, I think that, this is because of their, their class position, that they are part of currently a ruling class, and part of the governing administration. And I think that this reveals kind of their capitalist impulses as well, because this kind of othering of Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican people is also a colonial mindset. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that Bad Bunny is from a colony, a colonial possession of the United States that is still, you know, occupied by the U.S. government, and is experiencing poverty and natural disasters and all of these kinds of experiences that are continuing to subjugate the Puerto Rican people to colonial rule. And I think that the MAGA right is kind of playing their hand in this, and illustrating how they really feel about Puerto Rico and its relationship to the United States. And I think that that's important, that they're revealing kind of that colonial attitude towards it, that others it and renders it not American. Um, and I think that this, goes back to what Douglas is saying, that they are arguing for these things not just because of chauvinism, but also because they have a vested economic interest in the continued colonial status of Puerto Rico, and the continued status of immigrants and minorities and racially and nationally oppressed people, but being super exploited. And so I think that their their ability to draw super profits from these relationships, and use those to influence kind of politics and culture, is why we see that minority so powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's they have huge amounts of money, and that's an important and a vested, as Bennett said, a vested economic interest in maintaining these racist and colonial systems of domination. And what Douglas says in 1851 is he identifies that you know the Southern slaveholders speak with one voice when it comes to slavery. That's their only issue. whereas the forces in the north, the abolitionist and allied forces, are spread out and dispersed, not capable of that same level of unity. And I think that's kind of what's been coming out in our discussion this morning when we talk about both the ceasefire and the broader struggle for a just peace in Palestine, and also the question of Bad Bunny and the broader struggle for the rights of the Puerto Rican people and the struggle against racism and the colonial mindset here. Uh, right, the working class is and its allies are in the process of finding the unity, right? Finding their interest in uh, becoming the standard bearers for justice and for equality and for democracy in every situation. And um, that's kind of the process that our party sees itself as an integral part of, helping our class, which again is multiracial, multinational, multi-generational, helping our class find its leading role in that struggle for peace and justice and democracy. So I I think that sort of wraps us up for this morning. I don't know if there are any sort of final thoughts that our panelists had that uh, we didn't get a chance to bring into the discussion and do a quick go around here. Joel.
To that discussion about Frederick Douglass and the slave owners, right? Part of that historical structure of the Constitution uh, gave the slaveholders a disproportionate amount of power, right, through the various constitutional provisions that counted enslaved people, when they did not have, or partially, even when they did not have any sort of social power. So the slaveholders had a disproportionate impact in Congress, et cetera. And if you think about that process, that constitutional process continues today, right? If you think about all of the elections in 2000, there's only been one Republican who actually got more than 50% of the popular vote in the election that they ascended to power with. One election by one Republican president, right? 2000, 2008, 2012, 2016, Trump got a minority of the vote. It was only 2004, right? And statistical analysis of the electorate shows that when Republicans gain control of the Senate, for example, they do so with a minority of the total electoral vote, right? So that's just sort of that's a holdover from those old constitutional policies that gave disproportionate power to the capitalist class through the political process.
Thank you. Bennett, any closing thoughts for us?
I think your point about unity is really important. And I think it's especially important in the wake of this ceasefire announcement, because, you know, we saw in China that the Palestinian faction signed an agreement of unity to reconstitute the PLO, and they have found unity in their struggle against genocide. And I think that it is incumbent upon us to be able to find our unity here, not only to kind of combat our domestic forces of oppression, but also international ones, because we live in the belly of the beast. And so I think that this unity is of the utmost importance in fighting for a just peace, not only in the Middle East and not only in the United States, but throughout the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Bobby mentioned earlier, the importance of bringing out that unity between our struggle for democracy, our struggles for democracy here, and the liberation struggles of oppressed people globally is incredibly important. Bobby,
Yeah,
any closing?
I think we have to recognize we live in super scary times, and I'm so proud of the American people for being out there in the streets, and looking past that. So I think we have to tell ourselves that we cannot hide ourselves. We can't, burrow down. We have to be out there and push farther and farther. I think the challenge to us in the progressive movement is to find the ways to include more people, include those National Guard troops, let them know what their rights are, and how they cannot, be part of this fascist attempted fascist takeover, and in doing that also to keep the joy of the struggle, to celebrate Bad Bunny, celebrate our culture, and encourage people to go forward. This ceasefire is a victory. I know a lot of people, there'll be an attempt to credit it to Trump. I think we have to claim it, and then we have to defend it and push it forward. They never want to give the people's movement credit for the things it wins, but I think we could say that and say now we have to build on it and push forward and build that unity that everybody's talking about.
Thank you, Bobby. You have the last word, so I'm just going to step into the Joe role and say, stay strong, stay safe, and stay in the fight.